This is Jamie Drummond for Good Food Revolution. I'm here with actually one of my oldest friends in Canada, Chef Ad Long. Oh, wait a minute, Brad Long. Just your background there kind of cuts you. Should
I'll
get your
try.
tech guy to work on that. Um,
Oh, my tech guy.
yeah,
Yeah. No, that's me. And no, I don't know how to do that.
okay. Brad Long, Chef Brad Long, we've known you for so many years, coming up on 3 decades, which is a frightening thing to think of. Most of my adult life, I've known Brad Long.
Oh my
Anyway,
God, that's great.
so the last time we spoke with you was actually in April of 2020. So at the height of kind of pandemic lockdown, all of that stuff, you were at Cafe Belong at the Brickworks in your dining room, which was empty, and you were in the process of pivoting as people were doing at that point. Um, since that point and now, what is it you're up to now? What is Brad Long doing today?
Well, the pivoting thing was, crammed down all of our throats. But
Yeah,
so the pivot was, to change to from dining to takeaway and home
yeah,
meal replacement and some grocery and stuff like everyone did, the bodega effect. Um, and that actually worked. So, thankfully, but I sort of, I'm saying this backwards, but I didn't leave town because it's funny. I mean, it did, pandemic did push me out, I suppose, because I had to do something.
right.
And I had to be smart about it too. I mean, money, I'll just say that one. So I had to be smart about it. But I actually was looking for a restaurant in a small town,
Hmm.
in small town Ontario, in all fairness, because I wasn't just looking for any small town. I wanted to stay in Ontario, but I wanted to do the thing that I've been advocating for since the early 90s, I suppose, is when I started rambling on about where food comes from and organics and the idea of supporting the farming community and the stewardship of the land, all these things. And I realized, I guess the pandemic was an opportunity, but it also made me realize, why am I trying to do this in Toronto? Toronto actually, and by the way, this is the opposite of me criticizing Toronto. This is me saying Toronto is fully fleshed. Toronto is multicultural and is exciting and is
Yeah.
interesting and filled with every kind of restaurant and every fusion of every kind of restaurant you can get. So you realize, and oh, sorry, on top of that is that also a lot of Toronto restaurants, the independents and the really interesting ones are
Mhm.
actually doing local and seasonal and organic and fresh and supporting farmers and stewarding the land around us in the farms, countryside around Toronto. So I just realized I needed to be doing this in small towns because if you look at small towns in Ontario, they don't have restaurants typically. Let's say there aren't any, but there aren't a lot of restaurants that actually buy fresh food from
Yep,
their
I hear you. Yeah.
community. And that's this easier way of saying it. So if you set organics aside and you set local aside, and even if you set seasonal aside, it's sad to think that we just go out and buy stuff from people. We don't know really what it is or where it came from or why. And I want to support and help be part of a community.
Now, to be
Um,
fair, you had been living out with Toronto for quite some time, right? Out to the east of Toronto, well,
yeah,
northeast. Yeah.
actually, pretty specifically dead north.
All
Actually, I
right.
mean,
Okay.
if you go
Okay.
right up the DVP, I was
Yeah.
only just like east of the DVP or
Right.
the 404. On the Oak Ridges Moraine on 10 acres. So I got a taste of a well and a septic system, and I got a taste of
All that fun
growing
stuff.
market garden. And I
Yeah.
got a taste of more through my wife, Cheryl. We did chickens and geese, turkeys, and ducks. And
Oh, wow.
we had a pony at one time that came with the property that was, a little damaged, a little emotionally damaged pony that we put on a better place. I don't mean that's not a euphemism. We
Yeah.
actually put
I was
only in a better
wondering. Right.
place.
Okay. Okay.
Somewhere there we had goats as well. And by the way, goats are just too smart for me. So like I couldn't keep them penned up. And so, so yeah, we had already started the idea of what it's like to be responsible to a piece of land
Yeah.
and all the things you can do with it. And so we were, I guess, because when you move out here, when we move eastern Ontario, when we move 3 hours east of Toronto, and we're in between Ottawa and Kingston, so it's the Canadian Shield, and it's as somebody out here once said to me, you are this place, this part of the world is the middle of nowhere in the middle of everything. And I think that that was really kind of beautiful because it is the middle of everything. And it's also just utterly and completely forest. And that's the Canadian Shield. And it's just beautiful, right? The lakes and the forest and the fields and the rocks jutting out everywhere. I love it. Having moved out here, for me is just an extension of everything I was doing anyway. And I was making phone calls trying to find a town that had a restaurant that was
Now,
for sale.
now, just to clarify things for people who may be confused out there watching this, where did you find where are we talking about geographically here? It's a place called Sharbot Lake, right?
Sharbot Lake is where the restaurant is. I bought an abandoned dairy farm in Mountain Grove, which is, a town right next to Sharbot Lake.
Right, I see. Yeah.
We're all in the same township of Central Frontenac in the county of Frontenac. You can imagine from the name, Frontenac has been here a couple days. This would have been, being directly north of Kingston, this would have been as they came up the St. Lawrence. This would where they would have been logging off 300 years ago and taking a lot of the materials and the raw materials, mining as well. There's a lot of mines.
Right, right.
Well, it's done now. It's not so much a mining part of the world anymore, but it was also supported by major railroads that went away in the 1950s, which changed everything when the railroads went away. And these are just this is just the history I'm learning as I've come here. I didn't.
It was a big area for dairy farming as well, because you've purchased as your new home an old dairy farm, right?
Yeah. So I mean, obviously the Ottawa Valley was where I guess plusher farms were. The Irish immigrants that would have been plunked down here in the mid 1800s and to the end of the 19th century would have been a lot of miners and loggers. My ancestors that went to Port Dover would have been fishermen.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
And then there were people, people who were taking care of flocks. And, the pasture land out here is good. It's not good for growing a lot of crops, but you can grow pasture, which means you grow hay and feed it to animals. And so, yeah, I bought an abandoned farm that would have been, and out here, apparently every crossroad had a dairy and a cheese named after it. And it was just a fabulous part of the world. But the war and how, and this is, again, very much something I've studied and I'm a part of, so I understand this, is that after, before World War I, we changed all of our food systems. We got into centralization and distribution. After World War II, 50 years later, 40 years later, we started to change how we moved the big, resources around and how we managed them. And one of the big things that came in was quotas. I won't explain quota systems around eggs and
That's
dairy.
not for right now. Yeah.
No, but you have to buy into it in order to produce it and sell it. So it's sort of like buying into a very expensive club. And I don't know the story. So the farm that I'm on, because it was built in the 1920s and run until by the same farmer, as far as I can tell, until it stopped being a dairy farm. I don't know whether he passed away or whether it was time for him to get quota and he didn't want to or couldn't,
Right.
or There could have been political. It could have just been life. I actually don't know. I'll keep trying to find it out, but I mean, the records around this aren't. They're probably there. It's not my skill is researching, regional municipal records. I know that information is to be had. I'll have it one day and I'll tell you. But I mean, what I'm saying is that somewhere in the 70s, I would think, it stopped being a farm, and then somewhere in there he would have sold it. But I'm still only, I think, the fourth person. My wife and I, and my family, are only the fourth entity that has owned it, I think.
Now, if you don't mind, let's talk about Sharbot Lake, because Sharbot Lake is where you purchased an establishment that used to be a restaurant. Tell us a little bit about that establishment, its history, the kind of work you've had to do to it, and what you're actually opening, because I think that's what people want to know. What did Brad Long do next?
Okay, so what Brad Long does, ew, yikes. That's creepy, saying your own name. What I've always been doing is, I mean, since the early 90s at Pronto, is trying to understand food first from an anthropological, cultural, and then as that folded outward, you understand that the history, the culture, the anthropology is that we have sort of kicked ourselves at the beginning of the last century because of war and everything else. So food farming became, well, wrapped up in a lot of really complex political things around supply and all this stuff. And so I realized all these things, and the organic movement was happening through the late 80s and early 90s and became certified. The actual Canadian or Ontario certified organic processes, there's several entities out there, started to sort of solidify and start issuing in the mid 90s. I was in 1995, I became chef of the CN Tower. I was the chef of an Italian restaurant and got this call like, "Why do you do Canadian food?" And I just got back from working in Italy and I'm chef of an Italian restaurant. And I said, "What is Canadian food?" Right?
Is that the first time you'd ever really thought about that?
In a way, I guess formally, yeah. I mean, I honestly thought, and so I took that job and I started researching it. And what I found out was it's us, it's all the cultures that came here.
Yeah.
It's the indigenous people that were here, what they were growing, what we layered on top of it for 500 years. And now it's all the cultures that have come here and brought their seeds and their holidays and their celebrations and everything else. And that stewardship of the land comes from those people, and those products and things that grow there comes from those, historical things. And, my ancestors and yours and everyone else's and the indigenous people here are all part of all this. So that's Canadian food. Canadian cuisine really doesn't have like a really big list of things. Ontario has butter tarts. Quebec has, poutine and tortillere and a few other things. There's a few little things across the country, but it's not enough really to write a big thick book about, but it's enough to celebrate.
People have.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. And I mean, obviously, it's a rich vein still because it is a thing. It's just that it's not set in. Like, you can get books about the regions of Italy, right? Like